Thank you, Jim, and thank you to everyone for attending. As Jim mentioned, we're coming back to the US, and I will be discussing our preliminary analysis of Hestia data for carbon dioxide emissions, and we're also looking at criteria pollutants using a different emissions model. I would like to thank my co-authors. As it's already been drilled into us, urban population is growing very quickly, particularly in the Salt Lake Valley. We will be doubling our population in the next 20 to 30 years. Several studies, including nightlight studies, have shown urban expansion. Salt Lake Valley's topography is conducive to pollutant accumulation, which has already been shown to have negative health effects. And it is in the understudied Intermountain region. And urban valley is very well defined, and inversion is common in valleys and mountainous regions. For example, LA is another clear example of that. We have some strong political backing. The National League of Cities, the first vice president of that is our own mayor, Ralph Becker. And at the University of Utah, we are fortunate to have multiple data streams. We are able to run emissions and concentration models. We have a stationary network, and we have mobile measurements, which I'll discuss briefly, and satellite measurements are forthcoming. A very short cartoon about the inversion. As we can see, when we have a temperature inversion, we just have pollutants being trapped. And that is actually a view of the city when we have an inversion. So what do we have? We're looking at the Hestia product, and we have two different types of products. We have a GIS layer, which shows the annual total. It is subdivided into point sources, line sources, and polygons. We also have an hourly gridded product, and we have it available for 4 years. For the National Emissions Inventory, we have a county annual total for 2 years, 2008 and 2011, and we sub-allocated using the emissions modeling clearinghouse. Temporal and spatial surrogates, and these are gross economic sectors. Unlike Hestia, which subdivides into 8 different economic sectors, here we're just looking at 4 different economic sectors, and I will show that in a minute. And we also have a third product, which has just recently been developed by the Utah Department of Air Quality. It is 4-kilometer resolution, 41 vertical layers matching WRF. This is, has been developed using smoke, and this is for criteria pollutants. This is a rendition of the static GIS layer. This is from our latest version of Hestia for Salt Lake City, and you can see the high density of buildings. All the buildings have been mapped as about 55,000 road links. And when we zoom into a facility, for example, that is a hospital, we not only see the carbon amounts, the carbon emissions, but also see how it's broken up into the 3 fuels, which are coal, natural gas, and petroleum. Our sector annual totals in megatons of carbon, we can see the breakdown as expected. Coal is mostly used for industrial sources, petroleum for on-road sources, and natural gas is primarily used for heating. These are our CO2 measurement sites. Those are stationary measurements. Note, Rose Park used to be located in downtown. It's just been moved to Rose Park, which is on the north side of the city, but I will be showing the results for downtown. And just to put into perspective, Sugar House is a small, we would call it a neighborhood or perhaps a suburb of downtown. Downtown itself is right around here. And Murray is quickly growing to become a major suburb. And Hidden Peak is our background site, and Kennecott has a large mining facility. It's one of the largest in the world. And it is again starting to grow as well. And we can see that if I took a 3-kilometer radius from each of those sites, I generated the winter CO2 at these measurement sites. And we can see that, for example, the downtown area, the blue is commercial, so we can see that there's a fair amount of commercial emissions. And both Sugar House and Murray, which are primarily residential areas, they have a large red signal. The black is the total. And Murray is also a thoroughfare. There are large highways and large roads. That's why we have a significant portion on road emissions. The summer is a different story. Here we're looking at primarily on-road emissions being the largest driver, and we can see the different types of morning and afternoon peak traffic. Now, if we look at a seasonal time of day sectoral emissions, this is for the entire county, we can see that in the winter, primarily we have residential heating in the morning and during the morning hours, and that is when people are at their homes and trying to heat their homes. And in the afternoon, we have mostly on-road emissions for both the winter and the summer. And then we can see the spatial and sectoral emissions. As I pointed out, both Murray and Sugar House are either suburbs or smaller neighborhoods. However, we can see that Sugar House has a larger residential fraction. So what we gain from Hestia and from a detailed product as such is we can see a difference in terms of, even though they're very similar typology, urban typology, we can see that there's significant differences in their emissions. And this is an animation of both January and July. And we can see that the January emissions are much larger, mostly due to heating. So I wanted to break this up and try to see whether that is accurate or not. And now we can compare the commercial and residential emissions, and we can see that the patterns are opposite to each other, which makes sense. During the day is when people are at their offices, they're working, therefore the buildings need to be heated. Whereas at night, when people return to their homes, that's when they actually require the heating. One point I forgot to mention, this is using the 1 kilometer gridded Hestia product. There's also available a 0.002 degree, which is approximately 200 meters. Now, the on-road emissions, they do not vary a whole lot. They're very similar patterns. In fact, there's about a 1 to 2% difference between the summer and the winter. And that is to be expected. The majority of traffic is generally due to commuting, and people, unfortunately, will have to work during the summer as well. This is the first run of our June average concentrations. I've used the Calif model using some WRF meteorology at 1.33 kilometers. And this is our first spatial extent, preliminary results again. And this big signal right here is from the Kennecott facility, the mining facility, which is the largest emitter. Now switching gears, I'm looking at the sector annual totals. This is not from Hestia, this is from the NEI 2011. So the previous work was Hestia 2012, this is NEI 2011. And if we look at Salt Lake County, the same extent, we can see some expected patterns as well. Lead is dominated by point sources, CO and NOx are dominated by on-road sources. And the non-point emissions, which are generally mostly heating as well, are dominate the PM. Now we want to do a comparison between our 2011 NEI data and the recently minted Department of Air Quality 2012 data, and we can see that we match up fairly well. Again, they're two different vintages, but we can see that there's a fair amount of correlation, which shows a consistency between the inventories. If we want to look at the temporal emission structure, we again see similar patterns. This is from the NEI emissions, and we can see that non-point emissions, which are again are residential and commercial heating, they peak during the winter months and they have a trough during the summer months. Non-road emissions, which correspond to any kind of equipment that has an internal combustion engine but does not travel on a road, such as any of your construction equipment, gardening equipment. As expected, they peak during the summer months when most of that activity takes place, and during business hours. And spatial representation of the emissions, we can see that non-point CO and non-point SO2, they have different spatial patterns. This is, again, not surprising, but it does bring about the case of looking at a multi-pollutant representation of emissions as opposed to focusing on a single representative pollutant, What is nice is we have two sectors, non-road and on-road, that have CO2 emissions. And this has been graded the same resolution and the same position as the Hestia product. So we will be starting a comparison between those sectors and the Hestia product. Why does this matter? We want to look at socioeconomic attributes and compare it to emissions. And we can see that the household incomes and the percent of minorities, they correspond to higher emissions. And this is a very important point in terms of socioeconomic disparities. That is a point that will be expounded much later. And we hope to be writing a more complete analysis of that. This is at the census block group level. We have had a long history of monitoring CO2 from those monitoring stations that I showed before. For more information on that, please see Logan Mitchell's poster this afternoon. And here we can see the areas that are growing fairly quickly. We can see that Kennecott is growing fairly quickly, Murray's growing fairly quickly, and other areas are not growing as quickly. And please again see Logan's poster. He has a much more thorough explanation of this. We also have our mobile laboratory. We call it affectionately the Nerdmobile. And we can see a transect. Again, this is the downtown area. You can see a CO2 transect during the inversion in 2013. And that is a carbon enhancement above background. Also, there's this major highway called Bangerter Highway, and it runs north-south, and we can observe the excess carbon monoxide, particularly in intersections, due to the start and stop driving cycles. We also have recently installed monitoring equipment on top of the tracks, which is our light rail line, and we can see the concentrations across the valley. We can see, for example, a depletion of NOx right here, which is the intersection of two major highways. And we expect that to be caused by titration. And these local depletions exist at all times of day. We have a more permanent setup now, and we will be hoping to get some results from the winter inversions this winter. Future work, we would like to update the spatial surrogates. The emissions modeling clearinghouse spatial surrogates are a little bit outdated. Most of them are based on 1990 and 2000. We also want to adjust emissions release height. At the current moment, we do not have emissions release height information, but I will show in the next slide how we're getting that. And we want to now start the transport of criteria pollutants and hopefully do a comparison with OCO2 data once available. We're fortunate to have the transect of OCO2 going right through Salt Lake City, and we would like to perform some isotope analysis. And this is my last slide. We have 2-meter LiDAR data from 2014, and that will help us identify the building height so we can use that for emissions injection. I'd like to thank our colleagues at the University of Utah, Department of Air Quality, Kevin Gurney's lab at Arizona State, and previous collaborators, and also funding agencies. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you, Daniel. That's excellent analysis and overview of Salt Lake. It's open to questions. We have a little bit of time. Riley. You
got some nice spatial and temporal information on non-CO2 traces. I'm wondering if you have plans to take measurements and do multi-species inversions for acquisition?
I think long-term, yes. Not immediately.
Yes, Phil.
Could you say a little bit more about how you use the digital surface model from the topographic LiDAR for improving your emission load into the atmosphere?
Yes, the LiDAR data was just recently acquired about 2 weeks ago. And so with that, we're going to now, using the JS layer from Hestia, we're going to actually attribute height for the release of emissions. So we'll have to treat each building individually, and that's what we're going to use.